for many chiefs of staff, and it depends again on the organization, right? That there will be decisions that are delegated down to the chief of staff in terms of how you execute your strategy, in terms of like potentially in operational kind of management and leverage or in information, whether that's, who attends a board meeting, who does that, like those kind of, some of those decisions will be delegated down to a chief of staff. Yep. When you have a super powerful chief of staff, all of the decisions are theirs, and then they kind of just get passed on to the CEO for like a check, like, or, but this I'm talking about like White House chief of staff or like, chief of staff to an admiral. A good executive assistant is in charge of the CEO's calendar. They are there to make sure that the meetings run on time. People show up, the CEO shows up. The CEO has the materials they need to be in that meeting. The meetings are run efficiently. The CEO gets brought out when it's time to get brought out, that there's not overlapping meetings, right? So like that's their role. Now, what the chief of staff does in that scenario is that they make sure that the meetings should be on the calendar in the first place, right? So they are there to ensure that the right meetings are on the calendar. So trying to make sure that the meetings that are there are value add and have the highest kind of impact. They're there to ensure that the content of the meeting and the way that the meeting is run and whoever's writing the agenda, that those meetings are tight and are moving against strategic priorities, closing loops, not just spinning for spinning's sake. Yep.
Hello, welcome to Money and People podcast, the show that connects the dots between financial success and the power of human capital. Today we look yet again at another topic and we try to understand the role of a chief of staff. And to help us go through this, we do have on our show Miss Margaret Lada. Margaret, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. And for the sake of our audience, Maggie, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background.
Sure. So my name is Margaret Lada, commonly Maggie. I am a independent consultant, management consultant, focused on strategy and learning, and I also provide fractional executive and chief of staff services.
All right, fantastic. And just give us a briefing about your career path. Sure. Where did Maggie start from and where's she now?
Yeah, I have a very non-traditional career path for your podcast. So my background, 15 years in leadership in international development. So I come from UN, USAID, World Bank type of world. And I've shifted in the last year and a half into more of the private sector, into more strategy and consulting roles. Obviously, after the decimation of USAID and the change in international development kind of writ large globally. But it's been a long-standing shift that I've been doing either part-time outside of my actual work, my kind of salaried work, and a goal that I had to do anyways. It just accelerated. I think the events of last year accelerated that a bit. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. And to speak to the role, what exactly is the mandate of a chief of staff? And how does it differ from traditional executive roles such as chief operating officer or HR director?
Great. So I think the chief of staff is probably one of the most ambiguous roles that we have. And it's also at the same time coming up as like the role du jour for startups, particularly in the African continent. It does have a long history. So it started out really in politics and the military. And that is a very, very, very powerful position. If you think of in the US, probably one of the top 5 powerful people in the US is somebody called the White House Chief of Staff.
Yes.
I think we're all aware of some of the famous names, whether it's contemporary or fictional, like Leo McGarry from the West Wing. And then on the military side, a chief of staff to an admiral or a 4-star general is a very, very powerful figure within military kind of systems, whether that's the UK or the US or NATO or something like that. It's been recently kind of brought into businesses and policy adjacent organizations like foundations or think tanks to help sort out some of the problems, but with a little bit of a different spin. So writ large, while day to day, each chief of staff role is going to be different, there are very fundamental things about the role that are the same. And the fundamental core purpose of a chief of staff role is to be a force multiplier for a COO, CEO, a director, kind of a very senior leadership position within a business or an organization. And they really are there to leverage that leadership. So they operate across many domains. The first is strategy execution, which is really the big one. And so that in that case, they're brought in when wheels are spinning. You're in an organization, you're having multiple meetings, you have so many strategy planning sessions, but you're still talking about the same thing for 6 months
Yeah.
and nothing has been moved, right? So that's where the chief of staff comes in to serve that kind of core business problem. There also operational leverage, particularly for the principal or for the leader that they are working with. So if that's a CEO, just making sure that you are augmenting their operational capabilities and allowing them to focus on what they need to focus on. So that's looking at things like executive cadence and operational cadence in terms of meetings or systems or workflows, looking at time leverage, looking at ensuring meetings are run efficiently and that have the right content and the right people. The next is information. So ensuring that CEOs or leadership, whether it's a director or a COO or president, have the information they need to make their decisions, and they're not spending their time analyzing, researching, and pulling that all together, where they are properly briefed to make the right calls. Like, you can't make the calls for them, but you can make sure that they know what they need to know. And then the last is coordination, right? So cross-functional coordination. And so that's looking at being that connective tissue between whether it's operations or finance or HR or marketing, and making sure everything is kind of working together to achieve strategic priorities and strategic goals. So that's writ large kind of the core of a chief of staff role. Where it differs, and there's a lot of overlap and a lot of confusion with other more established roles in a business or an enterprise. So I'll start with HR. Because that has the biggest gap between it, but there's also a lot of confusion between the two roles, right? So, as I said, there's that kind of core fundamentals of a chief of staff role, but oftentimes they're brought in because there is a particular pain point or strategic priority. And what I've noticed in looking at just general chief of staff openings or talking to a lot of executive teams or executive search teams that are looking to help or looking to fill this role is that a lot of times that problem fits with people, right? So there's a problem whether, and that makes sense, right? If you're trying to execute a strategy, people,
You need people to
the right people.
You need the runners.
Yeah. And so you have it in, something kind of as, I don't want to say mundane, but as standard of a business problem as people's KPIs are not matching strategic priorities, and we need to kind of align these performance metrics and these management systems. It can be things like, are we hiring the right roles? How are we trying to hire? How are we advertising kind of that recruitment side, that they need to make sure that it's strategically aligned? I've also seen it increasingly as people are going into new geographies and new countries, right? So if you're an organization that's expanding and you need to look at the finance and setting up salary bands and what is your labor liability and how is that impacting your cash flow and your projections and who can you hire and who can't, so that can kind of come in as that like kind of finite strategic priority. So you'll see a lot of chief of staff roles that have a lot of people functions
People functions.
in that. Now the core difference is that an HR director, VP of HR, they own that function. They are responsible for the day-to-day execution, making sure that everything is getting done. Recruitments are going out, people are holding interviews, staff who are coming in are getting onboarded, that they're having routine performance reviews, that those reviews are being done and utilized, and that that if there's a culture issue or any HR issues, that they are being dealt with within the system. The chief of staff role is to ensure that all of those systems align with strategic priorities and to help and kind of augment the power of the HR director in making sure that there's that strategic alignment and that it's, and then for the CEO, that they're brought in only at times that they need to be brought in, right? Like a CEO should not be interviewing every
Yeah,
junior.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
so
definitely.
like there's some of that. So that's kind of the gap between there, and why you might see some overlap. It's just because that core business problem is a people challenge. For the COO, and that one has a lot more overlap, and a little less daylight in between those two roles, and that really comes down to the core of the job descriptions.
Yep.
And so, you know, when we talked through the domains, one of the domains of the chief of staff is strategy execution. And now, of course, operational execution is the purview of a COO. They are making sure that things are being run on time, that things are working, that things are moving, and they are really an operational and execution focused role. So you can already see that there's a little bit of overlap there,
Yeah.
just organically, with the way that the roles are focused and the types of work that they're going to be touching. Now, unless you're talking about, you know, Supreme Allied Commander of NATO's chief of staff, or, you know, the president's chief of staff, most often in businesses, the core differentiator between the COO and the chief of staff is management responsibility and line management accountability. You know, a COO will manage HR, marketing, you know, revenue drivers, right? So they are also in a lot more of that day-to-day management of departments. Traditionally, a chief of staff, unless again you're on that political side, doesn't have those line accountabilities and line managements. So if they do have line managements and they are working on managing departments, what they would be managing is within the CEO's office or the president's office. And that's, you know, maybe the executive assistant, scheduler, maybe that's director of strategy if your organization has that.
If you have one.
And then if you're in social enterprise, it's usually where the impact sits. So director of impact or impact manager, social impact manager. So that would be where their kind of management and line responsibilities are, but very different from a COO who, like in the HR description, is running the day-to-days. And the chief of staff is just there to make sure, and is really there to leverage and make sure that those are moving against strategic priorities and not just spinning for
Yes.
spinning's sake. And I think you didn't mention it, but it's a big one of overlap, and that is an overlap with another critical position for the CEO, which is the executive assistant. And I think that's particularly in startups, particularly in the African context, that I've noticed that there is a huge, sometimes, conflation of those two roles. And now that, very similar to the COO, has to do with what is the role there to solve? What is the core purpose of the role? Both a good high-powered executive assistant and a chief of staff are there to leverage the CEO's time and attention, but they come at it at very different angles and tackling very different problems. And so kind of the core overlap in those roles are really around the operational leverage, right? Making sure that things are running smoothly and that time is spent efficiently and the information. And so the easiest example of like how these are different, even though they're working on the same problem, is taking that kind of time management. So a good executive assistant is in charge of the CEO's calendar. They are there to make sure that the meetings run on time. People show up, the CEO shows up. The CEO has the materials they need to be in that meeting. The meetings are run efficiently. The CEO gets brought out when it's time to get brought out, that there's not overlapping meetings, right? So like that's their role. So if you have a CEO who's, you know, scheduled to the hilt and has 15 meetings always on their calendar and is trying to prioritize and choose which one, and the meetings are running on forever and there's no exit plan and they don't know what meetings they're going to, like a lot of that kind of just logistical angst is solved with a good executive assistant. Now, what the chief of staff does in that scenario is that they make sure that the meetings should be in the calendar in the first place. Right. So they are there to ensure that the right meetings are on the calendar, so trying to make sure that the meetings that are there are value add and have the highest kind of impact. They're there to ensure that the content of the meeting and the way that the meeting is run and whoever's writing the agenda, that those meetings are tight and are moving against strategic priorities, closing loops, not just spinning for spinning's sake.
Yep.
And so that's their role. So if you think about it, kind of executive assistant runs the calendar, make sure everything is running smoothly, and the chief of staff is making sure that what's there is appropriate and what's there is like what needs to be there.
Okay.
So that's kind of how those things are overlapping and a little bit of the differences.
Would it be correct to say chief of staff is the strategy quality assurance lead?
I mean, that's a good way of putting it. I think there's a little bit even more to it than that, because a quality assurance lead, like if you're a strategy quality assurance lead, you're making sure that the strategy is of high quality,
Yep.
right? And that is a role that the chief of staff plays, definitely, and part of their advising. That's also the role of the chief executive, right? So like, they are really there, what their core differentiator is, that they are enacting strategies and making decisions that are going to improve the business, right? And so like having that kind of strategic mindset. So yes, there's a part of it, but even more so, it's the strategy execution lead.
The execution.
So they are there when it comes to the strategy part, the strategic part, not just like kind of the operations, to ensure that strategic priorities are actually executed against. And where that differs is so many strategic priorities touch cross-functionally across all of these places. So a COO might own something until it gets to finance, and then finance might own it from that. It's very difficult to have that end-to-end delivery, and that's really where the chief of staff, when you're looking at that strategy execution, comes in, that connective tissue to kind of bridge the gap and execute that. So if you have a good chief of staff, you'll notice that if you are in a place where your business is, again, ruminating over the same thing, you've had the same conversation 8 times, that doesn't happen. You have the conversation once and then it's moved on from.
Yep.
And I think, and like, that's the power of the chief of staff. And that's kind of where their magic happens.
Lots of organization effectiveness.
Yes. Yeah.
And why do you think the role is often misunderstood or sometimes undervalued?
Well, misunderstood and undervalued. So I think misunderstood potentially because it is a kind of, especially for the startup world in Africa and in the corporate world, it is not it's relatively new-ish role, right? So it can be misunderstood, mainly if the people who are looking to hire or their teams that are looking to bring on somebody are misdiagnosing the problem, right? So you bring on a chief of staff not when things are going well. You bring it on because you've grown to a point where you need some extra support. Something is stuck and you need to get unstuck. And so I think in terms of, sometimes that can be seen as, and it's a very human reaction when you're overwhelmed, and when you're talking about the undervalued part of just bringing in someone to like fix the easy things, fix the schedule, read my emails for me,
set an agenda and a calendar invite.
Yeah,
Don't just invite someone.
Send a calendar invite. Like, so these things that are quick fixes and they kind of ease some of the surface tension, right? I think that can sometimes be what people gravitate towards because it's very easy and it's non-confrontational.
Yep.
Now, what a chief of staff really does, and where the leverage comes in, is having those kind of mindsets of saying, should this meeting even be on the calendar, right? Is okay, great, you have an agenda. This agenda is crap. Like, we need to change it. Where are the decision-making points and who's following up on them? And so sometimes people are trying to fix the symptom of the problem, and that's where they hire in, or potentially an undervalued chief of staff, and they're not able to actually fix the root cause, or kind of the main cause of that problem. And that goes also to the misunderstanding of the role. You either have chief of staffs that are, making USD $350,000 a year, clearly very powerful, very signals, or you have people that are then scoped on the other end, very menial tasks, very low salary, very 3 to 5 years of experience, very junior. And because that because people are kind of using it as a catch-all, it leads to misunderstanding on both sides, both a candidate side, right, both and on a executive team side
Okay.
or leadership side.
So it's performance review or
Yeah.
performance contracting. What metrics says, or what deliveries are going to define success?
For a chief of staff. So it's maybe a little controversial, but there are very core and very obvious kind of output metrics that you can use to define a chief of staff. Very clearly, strategic priorities, like advancement on strategic priorities, like have it moved, have they closed, are they on time, like those like very core things that should be like a key part of the chief of staff. The same with kind of more looking at operational efficiencies and cross-functional like alignment and improvements on those. That's a core function of a chief of staff. And then a little more woolly, but is looking at kind of how are they impacting executive leverage and like what tasks and priorities is the CEO, if you're chief of staff to a CEO or a president, whoever your principal is, are they focused on? So looking at, are they still in knucklehead meetings, meetings that they don't need to be in, or are they able to focus on and complete more of their tasks? But that's very kind of output level, right? That's like just you showing up and doing your job. If you're in a business, that role at that level should also be tied to key P&L indicators, or whatever those are for your
Because of the execution component.
Because of the execution, and because what you're doing, the chief of staff, the role of pretty much everyone in that organization is to increase and improve P&L.
Yep.
Right.
Ultimately.
So ultimately, we're all working towards that same goal. And the reason why I say that metric needs to be there is if you are a chief of staff and you're knocking it out of the park on everything that you're doing, but your P&L is still stuck, then you need to do a root cause analysis. Maybe it's some unit economics. Maybe you're pricing wrong, right? Maybe the volume is wrong. Maybe it's a misalignment with your customers. But it's very difficult to get to that root cause of what's like sticking with your P&L when there is operational chaos.
Yep.
Right. So you want to be tracking both of those, right? And and having that always in your mind as a chief of staff, also make sure that you're not just setting up systems, setting up structures for structure's sake, but that they're really working towards that end ultimate goal. So those would be the metrics.
Okay, fantastic. And I must give testimony. I did see you do it once in our past life. It was amazing watching you work, how you were able to glue an organization together, especially breaking silos and creating those synergies. And I think for the first time in a long time, we're able to, see strategy moving and say, okay, this is where we're heading to. And that was really amazing.
Oh,
Yeah, that was really amazing.
it's very kind of you. Oh, I like it. I'll come on your podcast anytime. This is great.
Yes, she's coming again.
I'm coming again. Anytime I feel sad, I'll come on your podcast.
Circling back to what you said, shouldn't the chief of staff have? I see the role as being strategic.
Yes.
Shouldn't they have some decision-making authority?
I think they do. Yes. They should, and they do. And for many chiefs of staff, and it depends again on the organization, right?
Yep.
That there will be decisions that are delegated down to the chief of staff in terms of how you execute your strategy, in terms of like potentially in operational kind of management and leverage or in information, whether that's, who attends a board meeting, who does that, like those kind of, some of those decisions will be delegated down to a chief of staff.
Yep.
When you have a super powerful chief of staff, all of the decisions are theirs, and then they kind of just get passed on to the CEO for like a check, like, or, but this, I'm talking about like White House chief of staff or like, chief of staff to an admiral. So there should be some decision-making power, and there should be some level of kind of authority in that sense. And that should be done very much in line with what are the strategic priorities for that specific chief of staff. That is a very difficult one, because sometimes there's a little bit of tension there about who's making what decisions and who does it fall to. But in those realms and in those previews, absolutely there should be decision-making power.
I think I strongly think that they should, and especially that the role entails, one of the core roles is executing
Yeah.
strategy. The chief of staff should be able to say yes, from the work that's being done, and I've checked, to see alignment with strategy. We're operating at this
Yeah.
level, and I'm happy for us to proceed,
Yes. Yeah.
this kind of way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that can it takes some relationship building as well,
Yeah,
because
it
you
does.
don't one of the other things, so when you talk about those higher end chiefs of staff, the fictionalized chiefs of staff that we might know from movies or
From
TV
movies, yeah.
shows, they are gatekeepers for the president, for the admiral, for whatever. A really good chief of staff in a corporate setting is a bridge, not necessarily a
Not a
gatekeeper.
gatekeeper.
So it is a delicate dance when you are having those decision making, powers, to make sure that people aren't seeing you as a gatekeeper, right? They're seeing you as a strategic partner. So that's kind of looking at things like, let's say somebody comes up with a hiring plan that makes no sense, right? And you're like, oh, this doesn't really fit the part. Let's go back and
Let's
try
go back.
again.
Yeah.
Let's go back, and it's making that collaborative relationship building so that you're not just seen as the gatekeeper.
I mean, doing that and such that by the time it's reaching the CEO, you should have gone
Perfect.
through
Yes.
quite a huge thought process.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the CEO is basically just saying, "Yep, this is it."
Yeah, exactly. And they know that what they're getting has been vetted,
Yes,
and
yes,
they're not going to get
exactly.
like a wackadoo idea that they're
Yeah.
like, I don't even know why people wasted their time with this.
Just finding out a bit more of how does the chief of staff balance being a behind the scenes operator with being that visible leader.
Yeah. So I think this is a very tricky one. And if you want to be a chief of staff, it's a balance that you have to make, because your role is behind the scenes leader. You are not going to be the face of the organization by and large, right? You are the man behind the curtain, or woman behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz reference, right? Making sure that things run. And so that's a balance that you have to accept, right? If coming into that role. And then internally facing within your organization, it can be quite tricky because you don't have those lines of authority, right? So it can be something that chief of staff can struggle with initially. It should only be initially, because there's no dotted line. There's no paper that says, I am in charge of you. I am your
Yeah.
boss. You must listen to what I say,
Yep.
right? But that's where a core skill set of the chief of staff comes in, which is forging that cross-functional alignment and forging in strategic stakeholder management, and getting people around a table, and kind of wielding that soft power and influence. And so wherever you can as a chief of staff, just be making sure that you're able to do that. Now, of course, it helps to have your CEO's backing, so that if you are hiring a chief of staff, you need to make it clear to your team that they are there to execute the CEO's vision, that they are
Exactly.
not an EA, blah 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 blah, or that, and also like draw the lines that they're also not your COO, so like they're not going to approve your leave. So kind of make that role clear to help them out. I don't think this is potentially controversial. I don't think it's a role for somebody who cannot operate unless they have written authority, because so much of what you have to do is soft power.
Yep.
And so much of what you have to do is that people influencing, and that getting people aligned and getting people on the same page, being hard when you have to, without like a lot of, that is a very specific skill set and a very specific way of working. And some people don't like that, and that's cool.
Influencing and
Yeah,
impacts.
that you can, there are many other ways that you can impact strategy and operations in an organization where you don't have to use that skill set if that makes you uncomfortable or you don't like it.
Yep. Okay. And are you able to share examples of how chiefs of staff have transformed culture, execution, or leadership alignment in companies?
In companies, specific names. So I think there's huge, what examples I will be able to give, and I may not know their names because, again, behind the scenes operators.
Yeah, most of
So
the time.
apologies to those folks, but a lot of the most kind of influential chiefs of staff that I've seen, or I've witnessed, and that's a lot of my background, is chiefs of staff to the president of the Ford Foundation, the director and chief of staff, her name is Holly something, for Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So they are people there who are really shaping the policy, how you're implementing, how you're grant making, how you're like for philanthropic foundations. In businesses, there have been very powerful chiefs of staff for things like Palantir, for things like OpenAI and I can never say it, Claude's parent company. They have these very very high powerful chiefs of staff that are there shaping and executing what the company wants to do, what that vision is, and they're freeing up. They're sometimes very famous and high visibility CEOs to do what they do best, which is sell and grow the business, right? And so that's how they can transform those businesses and those cultures.
I've always had a theory, right, that before one becomes a CEO, they should be a chief of staff first, as a building block or a career path to getting there. First of all, do you agree? Number two, what unique skills or experiences do you think that role should have the chief of staff to prepare them to become CEO?
Good, those are good questions. So I agree. Obviously, I think a good chief of staff could be a great CEO. I don't necessarily think that it's a necessary stepping block, right? So CEOs can come from anywhere. What's important if you're a CEO is that you can make tough decisions, that you can bring in money and drive revenue, and that you have that ownership of that kind of profit and loss and that financial ownership. I think one of the more traditional career paths and kind of swinging doors for a chief of staff is COO. So you'll find a lot of people who are COOs of smaller organizations becoming chiefs of staff of larger organizations and then going back to being COO or like moving through and kind of doing that in that execution framework. And I think a chief of staff role that is robust enough and that is well thought out enough and has enough of that operational leverage and strategic execution is a great path to a COO, right? And it is a great path to a CEO as well. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that there are lots of other places. But the more traditional one is the COO, just because of that execution framework. Now, what the chief of staff has, what a COO might not, is strategy.
The strategic
is that
component,
strategic component, which is more aligned to a CEO. If somebody wanted to go to the CEO route, which is, great, you really need to make sure that, and this is for any position, right? Whether you are HR and you want to go into like a CEO C-suite route, or you are finance, or you are marketing officer, right? Like the core things that a CEO is judged on is their ability to make decisions and drive profit and kind of keep an organization going and growing. So you need to make sure that you can align your work to P&L, into core financial outcomes, positive financial outcomes. And, back to our earlier conversation around decisions, show where you've made decisions. A chief of staff can sometimes be like the strategic advisor or the management consultant to the CEO, but then you're just an advisor. That's a very powerful position. It's very good. People can see where you would fit in. But the missing link then to a board or to investors would be, they can advise, but can they take the decision?
Can they take the decision? Those are two different
Those
things.
are two different things. And so wherever you can carve out space for you to make the decision, or when you're doing your advising, like be very clear about how you are making and how are you balancing trade-offs? How are you strategically thinking about decisions? Because that's the core differentiator there.
Okay. Well, should a chief of staff have a financial KPI, revenue generation?
Yes, absolutely.
They should.
Yes, as I said before, I think they should be tied to that.
Like a regular, so they should be a revenue target for chief of staff.
I don't necessarily think it's a target, but I think it is a metric that they should be like judged against, right? It's more of like an outcome measure. So if you think about it, like if you're looking at EBITDA, right? Like has that improved during your tenure here?
Yes.
Now, the problem with targets, and this is specifically for everyone, I think should have a KPI that is related to your financial KPIs of your organization. It's very easy if you're sales, if you're a revenue driving engine, right? To set quarterly targets, monthly targets. what HR does, what a chief of staff would do, what maybe even research and development would do. They have a longer runway until what they're doing turns into marginal kind of increases in profit. And so you want to make sure that you're understanding when we do this, should we be seeing, like, if it's HR, a reduction in our costs and like a more efficiency, right? When with these strategic priorities are we expecting to see revenue generation, and kind of tying it into that, so that you're tracking it. It's not like you're not responsible for like monthly targets
For
of
the monthly
sales or
no,
monthly targets of revenue generation, because that's not the cadence of which
because
these roles work.
you now go into the market looking for customers and doing
Yeah,
that relationship
exactly,
management, which
exactly.
shouldn't be the
No, no,
case.
no. But I mean, I think if, let's say, you're brought in to fix a sales team, right? You might have a specific target of saying, hey, you're here to like help sort this out. How have their sales improved in the last quarter?
So it would be more of looking at what their sales strategy is,
Yeah.
what they're actually doing. Do they have the right staffing mix as well? And also, do they, the right tools and also just right leadership and guidance?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And kind of looking at that, and if that's your core, one of the core business problems that you've been come in to help, like kind of leverage and kind of, fix a little bit, then you should have some KPIs that are attached to that. But that's going to be very dependent on what the chief of staff roles are
Yeah.
and what are their main, priorities. And that, can tie into those KPIs around strategic priorities being accomplished.
Okay. And how does the role accelerate leadership maturity compared to other executive pathways?
Accelerate leadership. So like how does that build your leadership maturity when you're in that role? So I think the biggest thing probably that is that accelerates your leadership maturity is leading without full authority, where you have to start to get people on board. You have to kind of lead without people doing it because they have to, because a piece of paper says that
Because
they
they'll
do.
be punished if they don't.
They don't, yeah. And that is really the best executives. That's how they can lead, right? The best executives, because they are able to, it's much easier to bring people along in a journey with you than it is to like whip their backs and force them to work.
They'll start resisting at some point.
Yeah, at some point. And also it doesn't just go to how you run your internal teams. You're also responsible, if you're a CEO, you're responsible for raising money. You can't go to an investor like, look, I'm in charge of you, please give me money.
Give me one.
Like
Sign letter.
yeah, that there's a lot more convincing, there's a lot more relationship building, there's
Yeah.
a lot more quiet authority. It's the same, like, you also have to deal with the board. A CEO is not their own boss. They have a boss. They have multiple bosses,
Yes, they do.
which is their board or their investors if they're a public company. So you have to be able to use that soft power and manage up in the highest levels as that. So I think that kind of quiet authority really helps in terms of leadership, and it's kind of like a master coaching class on how to do that, within your role. And then just learning the business, because you're
Yeah.
across all functions. So if you're coming up as a chief of staff coming from strategy, you might not understand how kind of financial operations are. We might kind of in theory understand it, but that day to day. And so it's a good way of really understanding how each of these core functions work and how they work together.
Okay. What are the biggest leadership blind spots chief of staff must overcome to transition into a CEO?
So do you mean blind spots that they might have internally, or blind spots that others might have for them
Them internally.
then internally?
Yep.
I think making that transition from advisor to the decider, and owning that in what you're doing, right? Like you have to be there. You want to surround yourself with very smart people, but you ultimately have to be the one that's making those decisions, that is looking at kind of how a decision will impact not just your own priorities, but the business as a whole. And I think that's like the biggest thing between, like, whether it's a chief of staff or a director or a VP and like those COOs, is that you're making decisions not for a department. You're making decisions not for a priority, but for the business as a whole. And so I think that looking at it at that level it can be a blind spot when you're focused on executing a particular set of priorities or tasks. So making sure that you have that kind of vision is important. Um, yeah, I think that's kind of the big one.
All right, fantastic. With the rise of agile organizations and digital transformation, aka AI, how is this role evolving?
That's a really good question. So I think one of the things that AI is helping with a little bit, and I mean, displacing in some senses some workers, but can help with the chief of staff in an agile organization, is really filling in a lot of that admin role of an EA,
Mm-hmm,
right? Still, AI, as good as they are, as good as Claude Code can be,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
it, a seasoned EA, you're never going to replace that kind of judgment call that a seasoned EA has. But if you're in an organization that can't afford that or can't access that, right? The AI can be quite helpful. And that is really important because it kind of allows the chief of staff, if you're in one of those ambiguous roles, to really focus on their high strategic leverage
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because the other stuff is being taken over by.
By AI.
Mhm. I think you can also do a lot more with less. So there's a lot more that as a chief of staff you can be leveraging
Yep,
AI
yep.
so that you are focused on your highest value tasks and where you in your brain and what you are bringing to the table are going to push forward the most momentum, and the letting other things kind of fall or be helped by.
So, so relegating the mundane stuff
Hmm.
to automation, and then
Yeah.
you're then clear. You have more time to focus on things that actually matter most.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then I think also you'll probably see more chiefs of staff being tasked with and understanding how AI transformation can go within
Mm-hmm,
within
mm-hmm.
their enterprises and in their companies. And so you have to be cognizant of what's working, how AI is working in workflows, what that, because we talked about organizational design, organizational development, operations cadence. The good chief of staff really needs to understand how AI can and cannot augment and
Mm-hmm,
help out
mm-hmm.
with the systems in their current
Okay.
state.
So, I just finished my uni, got my degree.
Hmm.
I watched The West Wing, and I also watched The Aids of March. Did you ever see The Aids of March? Ryan
Yes.
Gosling and
Yeah.
George Clooney. I don't know, it's one of my favorite movies. I don't know why. I just liked Ryan Gosling's role. Just he was a chief of staff,
I think
right?
so. I think so. Yeah.
That's the first time I came across this, and it was so many years ago. So I'm inspired. I want to become a chief of staff. I have no work experience, but I've decided I'm gonna be a chief of staff. What do I need to do to get there?
Ah.
Which roles do I need to take up? What should my career path be from ground zero to chief of staff?
So that's a really good question. I think let's talk about some of the core components that you need to become a chief of staff, because
Mm-hmm,
there are many ways in which you can gather.
mm-hmm,
There's
mm-hmm.
many different career paths. It's chief of staff should not be, if you're in HR, you can't be a chief of staff. If you're in communications, you can't be a chief of staff. That's not the technical kind of bucket that you fall into first, is not necessarily the most important thing. I,
Mm-hmm.
international development. So like, very, very out there, and can still work. But looking at those kind of four core areas of competencies, right? Strategic execution, operational leverage, information, being able to synthesize, analyze, and present information, and then cross-functional alignment. So those are the types of things that you want to be touching in your career and say, I can own this, I can do this. So if it's information systems, like being an analyst and being able to say, I can take your business data and I can tell you what you need to know.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an entry level data analyst, right? Kind of making sure that that's, that you have those skill sets, because that's a really critical set. Looking at, where are you able to manage programs? If you're a program manager, like a program manager is a great kind of, whatever the realm is, to get you to understand cross-functional alignment,
Mm-hmm.
people leadership, execution of tasks against a timeline.
Yep.
So, kind of where can I serve as an effective, at some point in my career, an effective program manager, so that I can show that I have those skills and the trade-offs to become then the chief of staff. A lot of people, that's an internally, if it's a very mature organization, it can be an internally promoted one.
Mm-hmm.
We see that a lot. So looking at, if you're in a big organization that you want to stay with for a long time, looking at, okay, how can I get involved in the strategy? How can I understand that? And how can I kind of leverage those types of things? So I would look at roles when you're entry level, because you're not going to be a program manager when you're graduating,
Yep.
but look at data analyst roles. Don't discount becoming an executive assistant if they don't really exist anymore. Research assistant, executive assistant, like learning how kind of the basic businesses
Yep.
function for a year or two. And then, anywhere, if you're going into private enterprise, it helps to have like core business experience, whether that's doing unit economics or like, something that is driving kind of the P&L, right?
Yep.
So then kind of building your way up to being a program manager. If you can get into strategy, definitely, like that's a really core, that's a really easy feeder,
Yeah,
director of strategy
it's
to chief
pretty
of staff.
straight.
It's
Yeah.
a pretty straightforward. So if you want to get onto that strategy team, obviously management consultants are usually kind of slotted into chief of staff positions. So if you are just graduated and you want to become like an analyst for Bridgespan Group or something like that, or Dahlberg, like those are also very easy career paths. But yeah, just keep focusing on those four kind of key functions, and as you're presenting yourself and as you're growing, map your experience to those
Yep.
functions, right? So that you can tell a very compelling story of how you fit these functions.
Like a brag sheet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, great. Lastly, Maggie, are you available to provide management consulting services?
I am.
And how do we get a hold of you?
Yes, absolutely. So I am available. I provide fractional services, so that would be a part-time. So this is something a lot of teams choose to use because they don't want to hire a full-time
Yes,
executive.
yeah.
It's too heavy. It's too heavy on their operations, but they need that support. They don't want to hire a junior because they need senior
They need
support.
senior support.
So a fractional is somebody that works a set number of hours or days in a month for you, kind of doing that work. And it's often a huge value add because it's more efficient and it was more cost effective. So yeah, you can email me. My email address is maggie@mklimpact.com, or you can visit my website, mklimpact.com.
Okay, we'll put those details in the comments so you can reach out to Maggie for any management consultancy needs. Maggie, thank you
Yeah,
so much. It's been a
of
pleasure
course.
having you on our show. I've
Thank you.
learned a lot about this show. Yeah, and yeah, hoping to see you again on our
Yes.
podcast.
Yeah,
All right.
lovely.
All right.
Always a pleasure.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
So remember, audience, to like, comment, and share. Give us as much feedback as you can. From all of us to all of you, it is bye.